welcome to Dead Man Talking. Tonight's story sees the warm welcome and return of our good friend, Mr. Michael Lockhart. As ever, please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help both the channel and our community further. And why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid crew. And so, with that aside, let's get into tonight's story, entitled When Johnny Came Marching Home. Let's get straight into that. When Johnny comes marching home again, hurrah, hurrah. We'll give him a hearty welcome then, hurrah, hurrah. The men will cheer and boys will shout, the ladies they will all turn out. We'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. Johnny started once more as the howls and screeches rose behind him. The sounds recalled the rebel yells he had so frequently uttered during the war, and that in cohesion with those of his fellows struck terror into the blue bellies, the invaders from the north. Before he came west, he'd been told that the wild Indians employed their own ululating cries that were very similar in quality and purpose to those of the CSA soldiers, and he shivered in acknowledgement that the cries of the hunting party he had heard in the too near distance worked well indeed, especially in dark and unfamiliar surroundings. He was alone and on foot, the rest of his small detail scattered or destroyed by the demonic savages that had dogged his trail ever since. He was sure that they were numerous enough to take him, yet they only chased. "I likely want me to suffer before they murder me," he mumbled into the grey nightscape. He managed to find the barest trickle of water among the boulders he'd reached an hour past. He stopped to drink his fill and to refill his canteen. He halted earlier and used the last of his powder balls and caps to reload his Colt revolver. Assuming that all chambers fired, he'd have 6 chances to take out the enemy. He knew that he might hit 1 or 2 at best, and even then, there was no guarantee of fatality. And he had lost his carbine in the skirmish and subsequent fight, and so his options were poor at best. He stumbled with fatigue, his sweat long dried, and the arid atmosphere drank new beads before they promptly formed. His throat was dry despite the recent refreshment. It's what he hated so much about the past few years. The dry, the dust, the pounding sun, and the shivering nights of the desert. He was in the foothills of the mountains, bare and sere, with few plants, yet he saw that ahead and above there was scrub and a dark line that indicated a pine forest. Not my own Georgia pines, but they'll do with the redskins or let me make it. He began to scrabble up the rocks, and to find perches he had to concentrate to climb. He was sure that the lightly equipped and barely dressed tribesmen that followed would be able to leap across the stones as easily as the goats of the high country. He stopped for a moment and forced his breathing to slow and quieten, and he listened. The noises from his pursuers, well, they'd stopped. They hadn't sounded for several moments, which had caught his attention on some level. They had either given up the chase or had gone quiet to approach stealthily at the last moment before they closed and struck like mountain lions. And he knew that they would have to give up their horses to continue, but that shouldn't hold determined warrior hunters in hot pursuit of a blood enemy. He strained to hear any signs that the painted ones might make. Rocks sliding over rocks, bushes rattling, false animal or bird noises issued for signals. The night creatures had also hushed. No insects or rodents chittered. No night birds trilled. Even the ever-present wind had failed and quietened. He started forward again, this time cautiously and with little noise as he could manage. He noted that he could barely hear the scrunch of his own feet or the light slaps and scrapes of his hands against hard stone. It was like the aftermath of a battle when cannons and muskets and the screams of the wounded and dying left his ears ringing, and the sounds came back only gradually as the battle bells faded. Only now the sounds did not return. Instead of ringing, there was a low hum. Peculiar, not like anything is making it, but it's just part of this place. He mused as he looked up and around. Most of the landscape had grown even darker, especially his back trail. He shuddered when he considered what would happen if he were captured. Maybe those Tonto Apache hunters crept up behind him, even as he stopped to consider the strangeness. Yet he looked up at the slope. The darkness faded noticeably, and there was no light, simply a lessening of the gloom. He scrambled forwards as quickly as his weary muscles would permit until he reached the barrier. It was not merely another boulder, but a rough-faced wall of white stone. It reached up just beyond the tips of his outstretched fingers. He could climb no further. He was too exhausted to jump and hope to find a hold, or, if he did, to pull his weight upwards. Instead, he stepped back and surveyed the scene around him. And the wall stretched to either side. It seemed to rise to the north and grow ever higher, but continued southward at about the same height until it curved away to the east around the foot of the slope where he currently perched. He hoped to find a place he could more easily ascend, and so he took the southern route. As the trail began to bend, he stumbled into the face of the wall, or rather into the unexpected aperture in the rock. The wall was where the trail abruptly ended, and offered the choice of either going backwards towards the known enemy, or into the opening. A cave, he thought with some hope. A place where he could hide for a while, perhaps recover some strength. At the worst, it would make a better place to defend, should he have to make a gallant last stand. He had to first ensure that nothing else had decided to make a lair in the space. The inky blackness within indicated that Erebus had already taken up residence, though he was more concerned about the earthly critters. When he listened, only the stark silence, punctuated only by the faint hum, greeted his efforts. His other senses having failed, he sniffed the air that flowed outwards from the opening. It was dry, like all the air, but there was no particular odour. If a bear or mountain lion was inside, it would possess a carnivore stink. He didn't dare reach out to feel his way just yet. There might also be rattlesnakes. Rattlers would usually give a warning, but he did not wish to disturb one and receive a nasty surprise. There was nothing to indicate that the opening contained any type of life. Maybe it's not too deep, he mumbled to himself, in need of relief from the silence. His voice sounded muffled, as though he was recovering from the noise of battle, or had a head stuffed from a cold, or was under water. And he looked back down the slope. It was darker than ever, though still only a seemingly natural nighttime dusk. He couldn't see clearly, but felt like he had climbed much higher than he had realized. He turned once more and shrugged. Best accommodations I'm likely to find this side of Savannah, and walked into the crack in the wall. The floor of the passage was sand over smooth rock, a treacherous surface that forced him to place his toes, and then flatten his feet, and then shuffle forward. It was just as well, since he had to move carefully anyway. The darkness was the utter darkness of a deep cavern, even only a few steps inside. It was odd, as though the outside light would devour the moment it entered the space below the mountain. He eventually found his way ahead, blocked by another wall. He fell to either side as far as he could without turning. The surface was exceedingly smooth and somewhat cold. He was terrified that he might become lost and perish of privation in the depths of the earth, forever alone and unmourned. There was an opening to his right. He turned and soon found that the slippery sand ended, and the floor was very smooth, with a polished feel as though something had built it that way, or something large had used it as a passage for countless ages. Something big enough to smooth both walls and floors, he thought uneasily. There was another turn to the left and then another, and he was headed back to where the original passage ended, but on the other side of the wall. He found another wall and a right turn. He felt that he had a mental cap of the cavern after all, at least to this point. He followed the tunnel upwards for what seemed a long way, his feet ever slithering forwards in fear of a plunge, his hands ever outstretched in concern of a barrier. And then the gloom lightened ahead. It was not a sudden or bright light, though it illuminated more for him than it would have had his eyes not adjusted to the sheer absence of luminescence. The tunnel opened into a large space ahead. He could not tell the origin of the light, but there was definitely a large room ahead. He shuffled out into the space, which appeared to have no roof. It was circular. Exactly circular. He made it to the center and looked all around. He couldn't see far and could just make out the dark opening from which he had emerged. At least he thought it was the same one. He saw that on either side of where he believed that he had entered the room, there were other openings of the exact same size and configuration as the one he had left. They rimmed the wall of the room at equal distance. He counted 7 of them, and if he selected the wrong one, he would never find his way out and home. He immediately turned and backtracked. In the dimness and on the flat, smooth surface that had begun to glimmer as though it were truly polished, he could find no signs of his own passage. Still, though his senses had been confused by the deprivation of input, he was reasonably sure that he had found the right opening, and he stepped once more into the blackness. The old church bell will peal with joy, hurrah, hurrah, to welcome home our darling boy, hurrah, hurrah. The village lads and lassies say, with roses they will strew the way, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. No battle with primitive hunters awaited him, but a scene just as tragic for those involved. He was a boy and sat out on the porch with his folks perched on chairs, and he and his older sister sprawled at their feet on the rough planks. An old man in dark clothing emerged from the front door. His face was grim and sad, and his chin drooped towards his chest. He looked at Johnny's parents. "Best you go on in and say your farewells. He won't see you tomorrow morning." With that, he shuffled aside, and Johnny's mother rushed past him into their little home. His father followed quickly at her heels, his hands clutching at her protectively, as though he would stop her from facing the horror inside, or at least alone. He would be by her side, as they had been for well over a decade. Now, he and Emmeline had followed their parents into the sick room, and he had trembled at the sight of his big brother, Paul Jr., shrunken, the scarlet that had flushed his features now quickly faded into a greyish pallor. He could still recall the soft voices of his folks as they spoke all too briefly to his elder brother. The shiver he felt when he heard his mother's wail as her first child crossed the Styx, and his spirit fled his fever-racked body. The stench of death permeated the room, and Johnny found himself retching onto the floor, adding to the awful odours. Their father had turned on him, and then, his face savage with grief and anger. Get out, you little fool!" He'd ground his teeth and kicked at Johnny until he had rolled over the threshold. "How dare you interrupt this moment with our son? It should have been you." All at once, Johnny could feel again the physical pain from where his father, rather a large man, who had worked the forge since his youth, had kicked him. Yet the overwhelming grief of humiliation of the words wrenched his heart, and for the first time in his short life, he felt it break. All the misery of those moments rained down upon him and crushed his spirit, even as it had then. His father was normally a decent enough man, if a little rough in his manner, and he had apologized after the funeral, but never again connected as parents and children should. His mother's affections became distant, and the coldness in their home drove his sister to marry at a young age and flee in the best way that she could manage. Johnny had himself fled to the war a few years later. While the swirling stopped and he stood again in the chamber, tears streamed down his face. The experience had been truly repeated, if it was not merely a memory or shadow of pain, but real. He touched his ribs and found them sore and bruised. Perhaps from the actions of the day, or perhaps the spectres of the past had more power in this mysterious cavern than in the world of light and sound. He cried harder and for longer than he had as a hurt little boy whose father had just uttered the ultimate curse. And yet soon he snuffled his last, crushed the feelings back under control, and walked into the opening on his left. He didn't pause, He was angry and tried once more to shift from grief to determination. He plunged into the Cimmerian gloom of the doorway to the right of where the first had been, and his hearing was once more nearly gone, though he could detect the distinctive tinnitus that followed the sounds of warfare, completely unlike the tinging of the hammer on steel at the forge or the deep, rich and lively sound of the Sunday church bells. The sights and smells of human conflict were all too stark and familiar, and the ground trembled as he charged with his cavalry unit into the enemy guns. Chickamauga! He knew that he'd uttered the high-pitched, ululating battle cry of his kindred, and he could hear the haunting, soul-stirring chant. Or there was a heat to the battle that had nothing to do with the weather. His horse gave off steam that rose between his thighs. His woolen jacket chafed, and he was wet with fierce sweat. He could see his comrades from the corners of his eyes, and imagine the searing pain of hot lead that passed near him, but did not find purchase. Horses fell, baying in agony and confusion at the betrayal of their human companions who'd allowed such calamity to befall them. Men and boys screamed as well, crying out when the searing projectiles sent their blood and bits of flesh and bone spraying, many of them crying out for their mothers, in last extremis of the fear of it. He cocked and fired and changed pistols until he had fired all rounds in all three pistols, his carbine long since emptied and reholstered at his knee, and then he drew his saber. Saber work was something different. It was a tool to address retreat. It wasn't much use in battle. One was as likely to break his own wrist as to damage the enemy. The feel of cold steel as it parted flesh and bone was much more personal than even close-range shooting. The slithering slide of blood first lubricated and then coated and slowed the blade. It jolted the wrist as he rammed the guard into the flushed, youthful face and saw blood and teeth scatter at the impact. It was the last face he saw in that battle. The Yankee invaders fled, and from there it was slaughter for a while. All from behind, and then exhausted Confederate troops rallied, and thus began the siege of Chattanooga. And those last faces, the ones he'd seen at closest range, had haunted his sleep for many nights to come. The ghostly pale features mocked him, and derided the cause to which he dedicated his blood and treasure. He barely rested from that point forward. After each engagement, more ghostly faces peered from the nightmare scape of his subconscious mind, when it should have been at rest. And he could hear the wails of ultimate agony and the cries of woe from those whose lives had ended so abruptly and pointlessly at his hands. He could feel the hot blood soak him, and then the startled awake, only to find that it was his own sweat. By the end of the war, he wanted only to go home to the little blacksmith and farrier shop his family owned on the outskirts of Savannah. Yet, satanic Sherman had laid waste to all of Georgia and the people of all stations. There was no home to which he could return. The fiends of his resting hours had dogged him all the way to what should have been home. His waking dreams were shadowed along with those of his hours of rest. The loss or scattering of his family and friends had shocked him, in sadness and tragedy of innocence pushed the ghosts of war back into the shadows. With no better prospects, he soon found himself in the service of an army led by the very man who had destroyed so many citizens of his country and despoiled most others. It was a place to go and trade, and he knew well, slaughter from horseback. He was already a cavalryman, and experienced horsemen were needed to kill off the Plains Indians. Sherman carried his persecution of civilian populations westward, and Johnny Lawrence went with him to try and leave the ghoulish spirits behind in the Old South. As the visions of fiends from his past faded, he found himself once more in a circular chamber, soaked with sweat that had not been in or on his body before he had entered a waking memory. His wrist ached, and the doorway before him, the one he'd presumed entered, was now gone. A blank wall faced him. The other 5 doors gaped and beckoned. "Try me," "Perhaps I am the way home." He could almost hear them whisper. Well, he had no choice. He selected a door to his right and plunged once more into the swirling darkness. Again, he found himself in a familiar scene from his past. The darkness enveloped him, and this time he found himself in a much more recent memory, only a few months past. He found himself under the ultimate command of General George Crook and the more immediate auspices of Major William H. Brown of the 5th Cavalry, and in turn his lieutenants and sergeants. It was just days after Christmas, and the troop had trailed a group of Yavapai to their stronghold in a cave at the Salt River Canyon. Their chief had bragged that the cavalry would never find his fortress, but he had encountered on the cunning of his own tribesmen, who were now served as scouts for the 5th. The only effective Apache trackers the army could find. His people danced at the mouth of the cavern to celebrate a successful raid on the White Eyes, even as their doom approached. Johnny was among those assigned to fire at the erstwhile radius at the front of the cave. The major had assigned a detachment to try and follow the back trail of the Indians so that no secondary forces would be able to take the troop from behind. And Johnny had no qualms about ambushing enemy fighters. He'd faced enough surprise attacks that he felt a turnabout was fair play. And besides, it was all part of the game when fighting the Indians. Constant foxes and hounds. Yet he could swear that there were other figures there in the darkness. Smaller figures that huddled on the edges of the light while the warriors danced and cavorted. Figures that prepared the food and performed other camp chores. Johnny focused on the leaping figures and paid no heed to the smaller ones. They were soon engaged in battle. There was a natural parapet at the front of the cave behind which the enemy took shelter and returned fire. Major Brown called on them twice and requested that they surrender. They only made derisive comments and issued challenges in response. The major hailed them a third time to offer the women and children an escape. This seemed to anger them, and the fight resumed, more heated than ever. It was hard to hit the enemy when they hid behind the natural wall or amongst the rocks and scree, or in the depths of the striking gloom of the cave. He saw that many of the braves clutch at themselves and fall, no more defiant whoops ever to issue from their dead throats. Others fell, and their whoops of triumph became pitiful cries of fear and pain. Then the order came to shift fire to the roof of the cave and ricochet the rounds down into the natural fortress. The technique worked, but Johnny had no idea whom he hit with his rounds. The screams could have come from any throat, man, woman, or child. The troopers were getting ready to attempt a desperate charge to finish the battle, when an even more desperate band of warriors erupted from the cave's mouth. The troopers made short work of the brave but pointless charge. They knew it was coming. The scouts had warned them that the chanting from within the cave had been a death song. Yet it still rattled the senses to have men charge hopelessly into rifle volleys. And the battle still raged. There were still more warriors behind the parapet, and their death songs haunted the air. Major Brown prepared the men once more for a dreadful charge to finish the conflict. In the meantime, the detachment that had followed the back trail had made it all the way round to the mesa that towered above the cave. They began to rain down rocks and boulders on the enemy from above, and soon, between the rocks from above and the pieces of crumbling ceiling, projectiles no longer issued from the fortress, and the death songs were silenced forever. Johnny shuddered and nearly retched. It was a miserable sight and no way for brave warriors to die, much less women and children. Yet it definitively ended the fight, and he and his brethren were effectively out of danger. They did not know it and charged what was essentially an incomplete burial ground. As the troopers filed down the river to charge towards the cave, a lone warrior slipped past in the night. He was wounded but still possessed the cunning and craft of his people, and the determination that only impending death willingly accepted could give a person. A few moments later, as the few survivors, all women and children, scrambled or were pulled from the dust and ruin of the refuge, Johnny was startled to hear a whoop in the near distance, and several insolent calls from the direction the wounded warrior had fled. Corporal Ben Johnson, the best sharpshooter in the troop, went into action, and the cries of the ultimate dance of defiance transformed to one of agonized yelps and a few gurgles, as death arrived to claim the last warrior of this contingent. Johnny shrugged and turned back towards the prisoners, his eyes locked with those of a young child. Those enormous eyes filled with wonder and shock, not truly understanding the profundity of what had just occurred to her people, to most of her family. She didn't cry. She wasn't old enough to understand the carnage around her and what it meant for her, nor, miraculously, had she suffered any physical wounds. She was simply stunned and confused, lost, despite the clinging arms of her mother. That gaze, empty in its innocence, troubled Johnny's conscience more than anything ever had. He knew that the army would take her and the 18 or so of her people who had survived under their care until the Bureau of Indian Affairs could take them in hand and settle them. Yet he found himself absurdly wondering and worrying about her future, about her ultimate well-being. Her tribesmen had fought he and his friends to the death, but this little one had nothing to do with the animus of the adults in her life. She had not taken part other than to cling to her mother when the loud and disturbing noises began. Those enormous dark eyes bored into Johnny's, and he felt rather than heard the unasked questions. Why? Where are the family's faces that bring comfort and smiles? Who are you, strangers? What happened to me? At that point, Johnny determined that he would no longer be a killer. The detachment from guilt he'd felt from just following orders had fled his soul. He would fight out a necessity, but never again for mere orders issued by people who were in turn following orders, and so on up the chain, until those who operated the machinery of the government and industry issued new orders based on plans in their own interests. These broken people in the cave were no different than his own people and family had been, driven out by the forces at the heavy end of political decisions that were made by those of far greater wealth and influence than he had ever had or ever would. He found himself a part of a heavy hand that won wars and broke hearts, including his own. While the troop moved on with the living and left the local dead to return to the land. Get ready for the Jubilee! Hurrah! Hurrah! We'll give the hero 3 times 3. Hurrah! Hurrah! The laurel wreath is ready now to place upon his laurel brow, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. This time Johnny had no physical wounds when he exited the chamber. The events were near enough to the present that those gigantic eyes had only recently started to fade from his nightmares. He'd ended up here as his latest hitch came to a close. The most recent campaign by General Crook had finished the war, except for the skirmishes that affected only a few. Like the little detachment of Johnny and his friends, he had tried what he considered the 3 most likely passages to exit back the way he had come. Now only 4 openings yawned around the room, and once again evenly spaced so that he had no idea which was correct. He had about decided that none of them would be, and that the entire place was some kind of miserable punishment. He determined to try something different and turned about 180 degrees to try the opening directly behind him. Maybe it will lead to something other than the low points of my past. He issued a silent half-observation, half-prayer. The scene before him was unfamiliar indeed. It was a town, a large and busy frontier town, and he was standing in a dangerous place, in the middle of the road, as riders and wagons and several other types of conveyances darted by either side. He found an opening and dodged across to the relative safety of the boardwalk. The town stank, as would any large gathering of humans and their attendant animals. It was noisy in a different way than a battlefield. It was vibrant, yet still cries of pain and distress, as well as mirth and merriment occasionally penetrated over the general hubbub of noises in an often indistinguishable babble. Johnny approached the shop with a glass window and caught his reflection. Only it was not him. Or was it? His features and hair, but with a slightly less careworn and saddened cast, and certainly a different attire. This person, could it really be me? Wore a dark civilian suit with a crisp white shirt and a nice bowler hat. The coat slid aside and there was a pistol in a simple open holster, depending from his belt. He could feel the weight, what he knew to be a truncheon, in his left inside coat pocket. How could this be me? I've never been to this place. It's not Savannah. It's too dry and dusty and new. He caught a gleam of metal on his waistcoat when he adjusted his coat to once more cover the pistol, and it was a badge. He looked down at it and pulled it out so that he could read it. Deputy City Marshal. He was astonished, but not completely. Well, I haven't made it back east, but I had considered becoming a lawman, maybe protecting folks like that little girl. But that was just an idea. It ain't happened. It was that chamber of horrors, playing a new game with his perceptions. He knew that he must play out whatever scenario the ghouls who designed and perhaps still occupied that terrible place desired. He proceeded down the boardwalk, occasionally having to take his turn on single boards that crossed veritable creeks of wastewater and passed through throngs of people. And there were of various types and stations in society. Some were friendly and returned his greetings, while others simply stared vacuously and stalked ahead, intent on whatever business had led them out of doors. Most were men in their prime, doughty souls who'd come west in a restless wave of fortune seekers. He noted that many of the wagons carried excavating equipment, and the hand-painted signs for many of the shops and businesses related colourful names relating to mining. The words nugget, ore and vein predominated. He passed a saloon, the Glimmering Vein, and was briefly tempted to enter. He was after all thirsty from the dry air of the wasteland where he had been. The air in this veritable metropolis was almost equally as dry. However, he heard a rumble of upraised voices and saw a swarm of people rush towards a space just around the next corner. They were clearly keen to see some event or other unfold, or perhaps to take part in some intriguing purpose. He was still unsure of how to proceed in his current state. Unlike revisiting the past, he had no idea of what to expect. Time unfolded before him, as it usually did, but in unfamiliar surroundings and situations. It didn't seem right to inveigle himself into some dangerous endeavour without having a clearer notion of what was happening. Still, he wore a badge. He had an obligation. The decision was made for him as shots rang out from the area where the crowd had gone and from which the voyeurs now fled. And there were shouts of warning and consternation as one man shouted, "Old Dave is drunk and mad, shooting at everybody." Another shouted, "He's got a sidewinder, Sam." Johnny decided that his best course would be to step back into a nearby recess and watch the events unfold. He filled his hand with his pistol but did not raise it for concern that it only create more fear and chaos. Instead, he watched and waited as the crossroads cleared. And finally, there was only one man left. He was large and lumbered drunkenly into the intersection. He was in the process of reloading his pistol, clumsily, unable to concentrate on either walking or handling the piece, but too stupidly intoxicated to stop either task. And Johnny knew his duty, and, somehow, he was familiar with this person. A prospector who'd done well enough but had blown his prosperity on foolish endeavours and endless gambling. Now he worked for more sensible men but who came to town each payday to lament his foolishness and blame it on others. He typically confined his rambunctious activities to fistfights and unsolicited wrestling matches. Today he'd found a pistol and had decided to loose his venom on everyone in sight, starting with his old gambling nemesis and the head faro dealer at the glimmering vein. Johnny stepped out into sight. "Dave, you put that pistol down. You're under arrest. Come on now, no need for more trouble." Well, there was a time that Johnny would have cut loose and fired without warning. He'd be legally within his rights, but he had matured through the pains in his life, and while he was still proficient with a pistol, he preferred to handle confrontations without resorting to gunfire when possible. Well, Dave glared around, looking for the source of the voice. He managed to get his pistol at least partially reloaded. It was a newer model that used cartridges. He now jerked the barrel around to point in each direction that he faced his fruitless search for the voice of reason. You get out of here, you goose! I'll show you what for!" he slurred. He was facing down the cross street, away from Johnny. Johnny shook his head and approached from just behind Dave's right flank. "I'll get that gun off him before he even knows I'm on him," he decided. He reached out with his left hand to seize hold of Dave's arm, but the man spun around like a striking viper and fired. The round slammed into Johnny's upper left shoulder, and he felt the muscle part and bone shatter as the projectile passed through his frame. He managed to draw his sidearm and get a round off of his own before he too fell to the hot sand. He heard someone screaming in agony and thought it might be old Dave, but it was he who screamed. Dave Haller would never make another sound of his own volition. Johnny's bullet had entered just below the taller man's chin and exited through the back of his skull, taking along bits of brain and skull. Johnny felt all the agony of the splintered bones and ruptured flesh in his shoulder, but realized with horror that he could not feel his left arm. His perspective dwindled and grayed for a moment. He thought he might be on the way out to the circular chamber. With this wound, he would soon bleed out and die. However, the grey faded once more into light, interior light now, rather than the glare of the open western street. He found himself seated on a couch, higher off the floor than the comfort demanded. Another man, whose back was to him, parted with some instruments on the counter. The man turned to face him, white mustachius flapping. "Johnny, I'm sorry. Your shoulder healed as well as it could be expected, but you'll never again have full use or range of motion in that arm. It amazes me that you can even grasp your hand or raise the appendage above waist level. You are strong and you kept working the joints despite the pain. I wish all of my patients were so diligent." Johnny nodded. "Thank you, Doc. Now I just have to figure out what to do with the rest of my life." He found himself in a circular chamber once more. 3 openings were arranged around him, equidistantly. He had an odd notion. When he tried to go back, the portals had led him to the past. When he went forward, they led him to the future. His future. He felt a dull aching throb in his left shoulder. He flexed his hand and shook it. It felt numb, as though he had slept on it and temporarily cut off the circulation. It wasn't as poignant as the relieved injuries from his visits to the past, yet it was still an encumbrance, and he wondered whether it had been settled upon him before its time had come. He stood and thought for several moments. Each vignette from the past had brought him nearer to the present. Perhaps those from the future would bring him back as well. He stepped into the next doorway. He was in a crowded room, and a woman bellowed in pain and perhaps a bit of rage. It was unlike any sound he'd ever heard emit from a woman. She lay on her bed with pillows stuffed in behind her to keep her head and shoulders elevated. Her knees were bent upwards, and he could see below the waist on her shift, which was hiked up to just below her breasts. He'd seen naked women, but this one was a stranger. And she was covered in sweat. Her hair was as tangled as a squirrel's nest. Her features were flushed and twisted, and yet he thought her the loveliest creature he'd ever seen. His wife. How did I get a wife? What is this place? It looks like the bedroom of a house. That pistol and belt hung on a peg. Mine. "Johnny, you gotta get back out of here. There's just no room for Minnie and me to work on her. Go be a normal papa and pace the floor outside and worry. The speaker was a middle-aged woman, and the other girl, who he presumed to be Minnie, looked like an even younger version of the young woman on the bed. He allowed himself to be jostled to the door and out of the room. As soon as he cleared the threshold, the door closed behind him. He shook his head in confusion and wonder, and then walked through the rest of the home. It was nice, nicer than he could afford, at least thus far in his life. He wondered how he'd come by the money to purchase such a home. Sure don't want to miss my fortune when she arrives, he chuckled to himself. He walked out to the front porch and, with nothing better to do, plopped into a nice rocker that seemed to beckon to him. The air was cool, but still dry, and he apparently remained out west or somewhere just like it. There were trees out beyond the little porch, and he could make out buildings in the near distance, other dwellings, so they were in or near a town or in a true desert. He was exhausted by his experiences and the hurts that he still endured, all the major ones in his life thus far. He sat back and decided to rest his eyes. Tortured squeals of pain from indoors and voices muffled by doors in distance encroached on his peaceful doze. He awakened to a blood-curdling scream and muted utterances of concern. He stood and began to pace. Something was clearly wrong inside that little room with the three strange/familiar women, the one who was so lovely and for whom he felt such a strong attachment. He realized that she meant more to him than his own life. He found he was desperately worried for her safety, yet he knew that the midwife was very experienced, Millie's own aunt, and she would do everything humanly possible for his dear wife. It was odd, but he felt more strongly for her every moment, and while he had no clear memories of their meeting and courtship, yet he still bore an overwhelming emotion of love. And then, over all the other sounds, he heard the thin wails of her baby, his baby, her baby, their baby. He was momentarily overcome with joy. He was a father, or would be one day, if this was all something other than a hideous illusion designed to torture and torment his doomed and wounded soul. The front door to the house opened, and a youthful, weeping face, so like that of his beloved wife, peered up at him. "Johnny, you best come in now. Auntie Jane says to hurry." He wasn't sure what to feel. Surely everything was fine. He heard the baby crying. Maybe it was malformed or sickly, he thought in near panic. He rushed in to see their child. The door to the bedroom was open, and he hurried through to see Aunt Jane standing over the bed, her hands pushed down onto the sheets of cloth onto his wife's lower abdomen. "So much blood! How can it be so much blood? Whose is it?" His mind fluttered helplessly in confusion and denial. He'd seen and smelled plenty of gore in his time. Much of it he'd shed, and some of it had been his own. He'd lived with his wife and been around other women enough to know that blood was part of their life. But this, there was too much. His experiences also informed him that one could not lose so much and still live. Millie was too weak to even lower her head towards him. She lay there, gasping in little shallow breaths, otherwise completely limp, eyes shut. He dashed to her side and clasped desperately at her hand. He wanted to hold her in this life, to keep her in this world at his side. "Millie, my love," he managed to gasp. Her eyes fluttered open weakly and rolled around aimlessly for an instant, and then settled on him. For just a moment, she seemed to regain her mind, and her spirit grasped desperately at her failing body. Her lips moved, and in the faintest of whispers, the last breaths to leave her body, she managed to utter her final words. "My Johnny." He only thought he understood how wrenched and wretched a heart could be. The utter agony, the fury, the stages of grief all flooded him at once, and he stood in a hated circular room with his two remaining passengers staring blankly at him. A two-way human mousetrap. His wife, his Millie, gone. Her lifeblood had flooded their bed, where they had made... what? He had never found out the fate of their child. Had the child lived to do more than utter those few pathetic cries of a newborn? Had I found the strength to continue, to ensure that my progeny survived? And he couldn't hold it. He collapsed to the floor and sobbed and shook, and it seemed that every ounce of his vitality and resolve had ebbed from his body and soul. He no longer cared whether he will be able to make it to and through the last doorway and back to what? To the pain that was all his future seemed to hold, just as his past had held so little else. Yet there had been joy in the moments that led up to the tragedy that shattered his heart emotionally, even as the bullet had shattered his physical bones. Had the time before, the time of bliss with his bride, been worth his ultimate misery at her demise? Had he survived to succor his own offspring? It was ultimately the need to know that drove him back to his feet and allowed him to stagger to the next doorway. Only two remained, and he cared not whether the one he entered held a lady or a tiger. He was on a locomotive that rattled and churned along the track, the smell of smoke and cinder piquant to his nostrils. And he was back east and indeed headed further in that direction. He sat across from a young man who gazed thoughtfully out the window as the countryside passed them. And he appeared to be just a little older than Johnny himself had been when he'd set off to join the cause and fight for his state. The boy wore a similar expression of determination mingled with apprehension. The profile seemed familiar to Johnny, something he had almost glimpsed in mirrors, but when the eyes turned to meet his, they were Millie's. Her son, he thought. No more piteous wails for this one. Oh, he looks strong, yet I've missed his entire life to this point. I don't know this stern young face or the events that formed him to be so. He developed a determination to wait and listen rather than speak. He wanted to know all about this other human being that had sprung from the love that he and Millie had shared. He still felt pangs at the memory of her loss. And finally, the young man spoke. It'll be all right, Pa. You taught me to ride and to shoot like a real cavalryman, and I'm sure that Colonel Roosevelt wouldn't pick a bunch of slouches for the Rough Riders, despite the name of the company. You did your part in the war of the Northern Aggression with the Indians, especially the Apache. Even as a lawman, you gave everything to protect innocence, and now it's time for me to do my part, to help those poor Cubans. Plus, we have to get back to the Spaniards for what they did to the Maine. I don't think it will be a long conflict. We'll just go to Cuba and kick out the army. They've never seen what the US cavalry can do. Plus, we have the Gatling guns on wheels. We'll send them packing. He paused for a moment and glanced at the floor before he resumed. I know that you worry for me, especially with what happened to Ma. But I'm a grown man now. I can take care of myself. Johnny snorted. He didn't know why. Perhaps his future memories held some knowledge that allowed the situation to hold humor. He found himself responding. Just what I said to my mother when I set off to join the armies of Georgia. I'm not laughing at you, son. Naturally, I'm worried for you. That's what parents do. It'll always be that squalling little bundle that your Aunt Minnie placed into my arms to preserve my sanity. You were what kept me sane through the ensuing years, as much as I ever was. Johnny winked at his son and chuckled. He wished that he had actually held the wisdom that his words assured him his life's experiences had brought. The odd juxtaposition of feeling what his older self felt, while not actually recalling the details of his future life, put him out of sorts and left him confused. The perspective shifted as it had done after his gunfight with old Dave. He stood with a cheering crowd and waved as Roosevelt's Rough Riders departed. He kept cringing, expecting at any moment to flash forward and find himself holding a telegram that spoke of his son's heroic death in battle on the island of Cuba. Yet there was no other lurch in time or in his heart, at least not emotionally. He felt a tightness in his chest. It had been building for days, and he found himself short of breath on many occasions in recent weeks. He occasionally felt shooting pains in the already painful left shoulder and down that arm that had therefore become mostly numb. Now the pain and a tremendous weight descended upon his chest. He felt himself looking up blearily at several faces that peered at him in confusion and concern. He heard voices and then an empty roar that faded to a hum as his vision became long, a grey tunnel that soon grew black and silent. Led love and friendship on that day, hurrah, hurrah! Their choicest pleasures then display, hurrah, hurrah! And let each one perform some part to fill with joy the warrior's heart, and we'll all feel gay when Johnny comes marching home. The circular room seemed to spin on the torture in his chest that he cast him once more to the floor, but it faded. He found himself clutching at his sternum with his left hand, the one that had gone bad during the visions, but now it felt normal. His other hurts appeared to be healed with the exception of a burning thirst. He doused it with most of the contents of his canteen. The humming sound had returned, and the air seemed to flow from unseen direction. It was only one door in the wall, and he hesitantly made his way towards it. He expected to find himself either back at the mouth of the cave, awaiting his murderous pursuers, or perhaps in some oblivion. Surely, I have a future. It felt real, not like some hallucination. I can't die now. I will make it to see my son off at the start of his own life, he assured himself. He shut his eyes and held his breath as he took the longest step of his life. Cool air met him, crisp and dry and clean, as only mountain air could be. He looked out on the rolling country that descended from his high perch. The horizon was rosy with a glow of sunrise as it encroached upon the fading night, and he was on the other side of the mountain. He faced the east. He'd been on his way to muster out the army, and they would neither miss him nor care if he started home. Someone would mark him as having served his term, whether he showed up at the depot near Phoenix or not. He was suddenly anxious to head home and to see the little shop outside Savannah. Even if what he'd seen of his future was exactly accurate, it did not preclude a visit home. To see the old familiar countryside and perhaps visit his sister and his nephews and nieces. To once more taste his mother's cooking by way of his only surviving kin. He had only room in his mind and hunger in his heart for familiar sights and sounds. The thick, humid air, the warmth of early summer, the distant voices of children's laughter, and the ringing of the forge. Someone had rebuilt it, he sighed inwardly. This was all that he'd expected and wanted. The cares of his life and what he knew of those in his future faded. The haunting memories of what he had witnessed, and even more what he had done, now lifted with other woes from his shoulders. As he drew nearer, he saw that someone had indeed rebuilt the old homestead and forge. He could see the corral and barn, and a group of people on the porch, an adult pair and 2 children, a boy and a girl, likely the boy's youngest sister, probably Emmeline's youngest children. A dark figure obscured the doorway for a moment, someone from the interior. Johnny hurried ahead, and his heart soared in anticipation of the happy greetings that awaited. He reached the house and entered without hailing the occupants. He wanted to surprise them with his happy return. Yet he saw and felt the gloom and despair that was rife in the little home, the stench of sickness and the approach of death. The children peered into a room and the parents had gathered quietly about his sickbed. The father turned around and spoke. I am sorry for little Johnny. He just couldn't beat that fever. He was a good boy, but I'm glad the good Lord spared you, Emmeline, and especially you, Paul, Jr. Wow, 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 wow. Certainly another one. Wow. What a fantastic and heart-wrenching mysterious story there from our good friend and brother from another mother, Mr. Michael Lockhart. Such an exciting writer, Michael. Every time something different and expertly crafted and woven into a tapestry of horror. Big thank you for your patience and of course your support, Michael. You already know how much we appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed this one as much as I. Well, guys and girls, another one bites the dust. But of course you know the drill here. Please do let us know what you thought down below in the comments box. Please do like and share. It really does help with the channel and our community further. Why not hashtag TeamFEAR and DMT's Cryptid Crew. If you're an aspiring writer or would just like to have a crack at things like myself, then please do get in touch with me at the brand new contact email, which is, as on screen, contactthedeadone@gmail.com. I really look forward to hearing from you. I hope everybody's had a fantastic week at work or school, or maybe you're a long distance driver. Whatever it is that you do, I hope you're enjoying it and you're getting stuck in and taking a fight back to life. But above all, guys, remember, be safe, not sorry.